Namaskara and welcome to BIC Talks, a podcast by Bangalore International Centre, bringing you conversations that move, inform, and encourage discourse.
See, Basavanna is now confirmed that he was born a Brahmin. But he never, though his father was Madhasa, in his own Vachanas, which is established inscriptionally, he never identifies himself with his father. He is Appano Namma Madara Channaya, Bappano Namma Kinnari Bammaya, Chikkaya Nammaya Dohara Kakkaya. He is naming all untouchable saints as his ancestors. In another Vachana he says, when the maid of Madara Channaya was made love to by the servant of Dora Kakkaya, illegitimately, I was born out of that union. And if I call myself a Brahmana, Nanu Haruvanandare Hudala Sangamanagavanaya. This is the kind of will with which Basavanna disengaged from his Brahmin background.
Vachana expression has till now been identified with a sect of Shaivism called Virashaivism or Lingayatism. Its historical framework is considered to be 12th century in Kalyana, the imperial capital of the Chalukyas and later of Kalachuryas. The main progenitor of Lingayatism, say scholars, was Basavanna, finance minister of Emperor Bijjala. The literature also further assumes that Basavanna set up in Kalyana Anubhava Mantapa, an assembly of saint poets. The Vachana poets are supposed to have gathered in this assembly to debate matters spiritual, compose, read and discuss each other's compositions. The Lingayat literary harvest is said to be contemporaneous with the active period of Basavanna's tenure with the emperor. This episode of BIC Talks, which outlines the new approach to literary and cultural context of Vachanas, was the second of the four-part masterclass series titled The Paths of the Hand, Heart and Void by poet, playwright and professor of theatre and performance studies, Jawaharlal Nehru University, Professor H.S. Shivaprakash, on the Vachana efflorescence of Karnataka, examines the neglected contribution and philosophy of artisan Vachana poets to show that it was an independent, soteriological approach different from bhakti and mysticism. And now, over to Professor Shivaprakash.
Good evening, everybody. Today, I'd like to focus on one of the three important themes or spiritual orientations that we find in the Vachana corpus. In my previous presentation, I pointed out that it's very inaccurate to subsume all the Vachana poets and all the Vachana texts into the category of Lingayat Virashaiva literature, as many scholars have done, and not even into the nomenclature of bhakti alone. I said there are three approaches to spirituality, three soteriologies in the Vachanas, and one is labor-based. This word labor is not an accurate translation, but I'm not finding any other equivalent in English. The other is bhakti, which is normally translated devotion. I pointed out how it is. Devotion is the wrong translation of the word. We like to retain the word bhakti. The third I call the path of void, emptiness, which is the Natha Siddha stream in the Vachanas. Out of 240 odd Vachana poets whose compositions have now been made accessible to us through enormous labor put in by scholars starting from Harkatti and Basavanna and others, right up to the Professor Kalburgi's Kalburgi edited Vachana volumes published by Government of Karnataka. Nearly 60 of them are from laboring classes. And like I said, artisan, I used the word artisan in the past, but artisan is somebody who has his own instruments of labor, but the laboring class includes people like town criers and transporters and toll collectors and so many of them, the basket makers and so on. So, prostitutes, for example, also German Vachana poets. One of them is a burglar. He's called Kannada Maritande. And there's a prostitute called Sule Sankava. And there is a toddy tapper. His name is Hendada Maritande. So all these people, and there's a hunter, Ganada Kandappa. There's a doctor, Vaidya Sanganna. There is a farmer, Vakkaliga Muddanna. And what is interesting is, when they express the spiritual experience, they do not speak in the language of bhakti. And bhakti, last time I tried to talk about what it means to me. Bhakti is a kind of rasa, ecstasy. And two great exponents of bhakti, Acharya Utpaladeva of Kashmir and Madhusudan Saraswati in his text, both of them talk about bhakti as a kind of rasa. There were later day scholars, particularly of Gaudiya Vaishnavism, who tried to interpret bhakti as a kind of rasa, but in these texts, bhakti itself is looked upon as a kind of rasa. So it's joy. In Vachanas also, whenever they talk about bhakti, they speak in the language of ecstasy. Kamahadevi says in one of her Vachanas, Haaduvenu, Haaduvenu, Kunidaduvenu, Nadidaduvenu. And bhakti expresses itself both through song and dance than through reading poetry. In the Narada Bhakti Sutra, Lord himself says, Yatra madbhakta gayanti tatatishtamina. Wherever my devotees are singing, I am present there. The language of joy, ecstasy, melting. That's why they talk about melting. Rasa is melting. Kamadi says, Tanu karagadavaralli pushpavanollayaninu. Unless the body melts, you won't accept flowers from such people. Mana karagadavaralli gandhakshatayanullayanu. Unless the heart melts, you won't accept sandal and rice, holy rice from such people. So it's melting, but the approach of these laboring Vachana poets is totally different and is unique in the context of Bhakti and Siddha traditions in India. The laboring classes are included in temple-based Bhakti traditions. For example, historians have told us how in South India, temples, which are very simple institutions, when the Bhakti flourished, the Bhakti of Alvas and Nayanmas flourished in Tamil Nadu. By the 10th century, they got royal patronage and they developed into huge institutions. And the number of people who had to put in service of the temple also increased by leaps and bounds. There's somebody, and different castes were given different acts of labor to contribute to the temple services. For example, florists would supply flowers and so on and so forth. And today, in some of the shrines in India, The florists, people who come and supply flowers and incense sticks, are Muslims. For example, there's a shrine of Savargi Shivlingeshwara in Gokak Taluk in Belgaum district, and the people who come and sell flowers at the shrine are Muslims. So different castes were put in, given different services, different jobs to contribute to the temple services. But this kind of seva, service, is something very different from what Vachana poets indicate by a unique term, kayaka. Of course, a lot of people who talk about Vachanas, they chant like mantra, one phrase, kayaka vai kailasa, and they say Basavanna said this. And they're completely wrong. Because Basavanna never uses the word kayaka. What he says is kayave kailasa, body is the temple. Kayaka, manual labor, something done with the body manually. This word, my friend Professor Srinivas is a great Sanskritist, and confirmed it with him. Word kayaka in the sense of labor is not there, was not there in Sanskrit also. And we don't find this word used in other bhakti traditions. This kaya, the body being compared to the temple, we find in many bhakti traditions. In the tantras also, body is described as Brahmadesha. This is very common. Whereas kayaka as a means of spiritual illumination, manual labor as a means of spiritual illumination, is the hallmark of Vachana poetry, which we don't find anywhere else. And I'm going to read out some translations of Vachanas of this orientation. And all these Vachana poets who kind of uphold labor, kayaka, the word labor doesn't, has the flavor of this kayaka, are from laboring classes. For example, there is a hunter called Gana the Kannappa. Gana in present day Kannada means this oil pressing thing, but here Gana means Gada, is a hunter. And in his Vachana, the act of hunting is sacred. It becomes, just as in Sringara Bhakti, man-woman relationship becomes a metaphor sometimes, and sometimes a metonym for divine love, as in Jayadeva's Gita Govindam. Here, labor becomes metaphor for spiritual sadhana practice. And the word kayaka is closely associated with the concept of dasoha. And I owe it to Professor Shetter, who once pointed out to me why Sharanas use the word dasoha, which is to counter the institution of dana and dharma. Now, if somebody wants to, formulate the ethics of Vachana poets, two things are taboo then. Some people say meat and alcohol is taboo. I don't agree, because there's no guarantee. Basavanna holesa may not mean meat, according to me. But two things are taboo, certainly. Parasati, paradhana. Another man's woman, somebody else's wealth. And who gave dana to whom? Is the rulers, kings and noblemen of those days, who gave dana to deserving people. And how did they generate the surplus wealth to give dana? Through the loot of the conquered people. The bigger the king, the bigger the emperor, the greater the bounty that you looted from other countries, other people. So this paradhani parasati, that's why Vachana poets rejected royal patronage. There's a contentious aspect of this. Basavanna was with Bijjala as his finance minister. Some Vachana enthusiasts say he was the prime minister of Bijjala. There was no office of prime minister in those days. Bhakts keep on saying all kinds of things. But Basavanna was employed with Bijjala, but he was not a praise singer of the king. He expressly condemns kingship in one of his Vachana. He says, Vyadhanando malava bilidare. Where a hunter hunts down a rabbit, Saluva hagake koduvarayya. People bite with whichever currency is around. Neladaldana henanandare. If somebody brings the dead body of a king, ondadikegu kodarayya. They won't even bite for an akanet. Molaninda karakashta narana baduve. Worse than a rabbit is man's life. Nerenambo namakural sangmadi. Elsewhere he says, Mahadani kural sangayanallade, ani bijjaranganjuveneya. I fear only Kural Sangamadeva, who is Mahadani, and Bijjala is a Dani. He's a king, earthly king. And why should I be afraid of him? So this, if not complete rejection, this indifference to the state has always been there with Vachanas, in Bhakti traditions. In Tamil also, Tirunavukara Appar, who was one of the Mudal Mover, the first three Shaivite saints, he said, Nam Arkum Anjo, we're not afraid of any of these kings, he says. Periyalvar, in one of his famous songs in Diva Prabandham, it's called Palland, Palland, Palla Irattand. Prosper for years and years, for 1,000 years. He talks in the tone of a Brahmin priest who is consecrating a king. But at the end of the poem, he says, I am not blessing any king of the earth, only that Narayana who is the king of the whole world. Now, in Vachanas, I think they go one step further. When Tamil saints were alive, the state in South India was not so big, and the temple was a small institution. Then things changed by 10th century. When Raja Chola built this Brihodeshwara temple in the first century of the Common Era, after his conquest of the regions near the Ganga, that's why it was called Gangek Kondamaindan. So to celebrate his victory, he did this, and then as king's power increased, the temple's structure also increased, and the tower grew bigger and bigger. By the 12th century, temples had become an exploitative institution. Divine service was one of the things they did. Temples were also banks, temples were also license issuing institutions. There is an inscription which Appadurai in his book Cultural History of South India, he shows that the Tanjavur temple issued license to 100 Devadasis on the single day. So temple was doing all kinds of things. And temple survived on they were the benefactors of the rulers of the times. And the wealth came from the surplus value of rulers. And Dana was part of this system of generating extraction and of surplus value. But Dasoha is not. Dasoha is a Sharana. Last time I said I'm avoiding the word Lingayat Virashaiva because Vachana poets themselves hardly use this word of themselves. The word they use for self-reference is Sharana. So Sharanas rejected this Dana and Dharma. There's one episode in the Shunya Sampadana, which is a dramatic anthology of Vachanas, which was, of course, I'll talk about it later, came into being. There were 4 compilers of Shunya Sampadana. Shunya Sampadana is gathering of emptiness. But this word Shunya is not found in authentic Vachana text. The word we find there is Bayalu. This also later come from Buddhism and all this concept of shunya and so on. Anyway, this talks about how the Sharanas from laboring classes challenge this somebody who's been considered by the compiler of Shunya Sampadana as the leader of the Vachana tradition, Allama Prabhu, is challenged by these artisans, rope makers and women. But Shunya Sampadana is an attempt to gradually silence the voices of the laboring class, women and laboring classes. So they produced the narrative about the Vachana tradition, which was, for the most part, blindly and uncritically accepted by both Vachana scholars and even writers like me and Girish Kanar and Lankesh, who wrote plays about this episode, Kalyana episode. And this mythification of the Sharana culture started. I'm not calling them movements, God forbid, call it cultures, traditions. Started with the first Telugu biographer of Basavanna, Palkurke Somanatha, in his Basav Puranam. So this mythification started, that mythical narrative that was constructed by poetic narrators and the anthologists and the priestly class of 200-300 years after the Vachana efflorescence, that has become the basis of our understanding of Vachana, interpretation of Vachana still now, and we have to look beyond that to see Sharanas for what they stood for. And though numerically these laboring classes dominate the Vachana poets, it's unfortunate that their works are not properly preserved. In the manuscripts, most of the manuscripts are about these celebrated Vachana poets. And Shunya Sampadana itself is a systematic effort to suppress and silence the voices of laboring classes and women. And another reason why we should look closely into this Kayaka expression of Vachanas is that it's unique. There are some references to this, labor people. For example, Kabir was a weaver. He says he sometimes used metaphors of weaving, but as part of his bhakti. Chanting Ram Nam is also weaving. It's not that kind of thing. Undivided attention to the act of labor itself. Something like in two spiritual texts, one is Buddha's Satipatthana Suttam, Majjhima Nikaya, and in Vijnana Bhairava, text from Kashmir, Manual Meditation, Kashmir Shaivism, they talk about anything, any part of your experience can be the object of meditation. But even they, of course, in principle, even labor that you do can be part of meditation, but they don't talk about it. So before I make a few more observations on this very important but neglected dimension of Vachanas, let me read some of the Vachanas for you. And Adya Vachanakaara, Basavanna says, Adyara Vachana Purusha Kandaya. The Vachanas of Adya, which is ancestors, is Purusha, the philosopher's stone. This image of Purusha is recurrent particularly in Natha Siddha, in Tantric traditions. And the metaphor of alchemy is also recurrent in other spiritual traditions like Sufism and in Chinese Buddhism. It's there in Vachana also. Adya Vachana Purusha Kandaya. So, who is the Adya? See, Basavanna is now confirmed that he was born a Brahmin. But he never, though his father was Madhavasa, in his own Vachanas, which is established inscriptionally, he never identifies himself with his father. He is Appano Namma Madara Channaya, Bappano Namma Kinnari Bammayya. Chikkayya nammayya dohara kakkayya. He is naming all untouchable saints as his ancestors. Another Vachana he says, when the maid of Madara Chennaya was made love to by the servant of Dora Kakkaya, illegitimately, I was born out of that union. And if I call myself a Brahmana, Nanu Haruvanandare Kudala Sangamanaguvanaya. This is the kind of will with which Basavanna disengaged from his Brahmin background. So the first Vachanakaara is Madara Chennaya, who is an artisan. Madaya the cobbler, Chennaya the cobbler. And of course, some scholars have tried to diminish the significance because our great Vachana scholar, Professor Chidanamurti, he tried in vain to demonstrate that Madara Chennaya was only an elder contemporary of Basavanna, and he learned writing Vachanas. But it's stupid because the language of Madara Chennaya is old. If you look at the history of Kannada language, it's much older than and also the idiom is more well formed in Basavanna than Madara Chennaya. So he's the first Vachanakaara. The first Vachanakaara was an artisan and he was a cobbler. And another great ancestor whom Basavanna mentions again and again is Devara Dasimaya. Dasimaya, the weaver. And he too was an artisan. And in this context, I should mention one more thing, because many scholars say that Sharanas, brought into vogue this practice of wearing Shivalingam on the body. It's called Ishtalinga. They rejected the Sthavarlinga of temples. But my own reading in the Vachana text in the last 30 years, from that I learned that not all of them believe in the wearing of Ishtalinga. In fact, in first Shunya Sampadne, when Siddharama comes to Kalyana to meet Basavanna, some of Basavanna's followers tell Basavanna, please give him the initiation in Ishtalinga. And there's a debate whether this should be done. And Allama Prabhu says, Siddharama is already an evolved yogi, he doesn't need any other initiation. But in the second, third, and fourth versions of Shunya Sampadne, this episode is rewritten. Siddharama is given the Diksha. By that time, this sect of Sharanas was on the way to becoming a caste. It was becoming institutionalized. So different Shunya Sampadna texts, anthology shows different stages of that institutionalization. Madara Chennaya never talks about the wearing of Ishtalinga. Neither does another cobbler saint, Madara Dhuraya. There are some of his vachanas which talk about this theological concept, but obviously those vachanas are interpolated. The language is very different. But Dasimaya talks about the Ishtalinga worship, also about his labor as a spiritual practice. Now I read two vachanas. He is talking about this, the act of weaving, Dasimaya. After tightening the warp, after arranging the golden border, after pushing the pedal down with feet so that the frame moves up and down, the shuttle point eats up the skein. Who weaves the sari? You or me, O Ramanatha. So when he is weaving a piece of cloth, he becomes Shiva himself. It's not surrender to the divine, it is transformation of the self into the divine through the act of labor. It's another kind of Advaita. It's characteristic of our Kayika-centered Vachana poets. And now Nada Vachanaya was perhaps the first extant Vachana poet. approximately a century earlier than Basavanna. So Dalit sensibility expresses itself in Kannada for the first time way back in the 11th century. If you are willing to extend the meaning of the word Dalit. After he's talking about the act of tanning and making sandals. There's a kind of yoga. After erecting three pillars, the gross, the subtle, and the causal bodies. After beating the buffalo's rough hide, after removing the flesh, with the staff of the manifest and the hidden, after tanning the hide with the fire of dualism, after pouring the caustic juice of quintessence into the high pouch of awareness, the blemishes of soul thus destroyed have come to take the sandals to his feet. Take care, not of the ground below, but of the path your feet and sandals take. Do not be enslaved by the hand-awl, blade, or peg, but realize Rama Rama, your own true self, joy of joys. This is mantra, signature. Do not be enslaved. You're using these instruments of labor, the hand-awl and blade, peg. Don't be enslaved by them. Through these, realize you are the highest cosmic principle, is the source of all joy. Again, labor is here used as a metaphor for spiritual process and also a door to the communion with the divine. And Dulaya the cobbler, who too could have been earlier than Basavanna, who also never mentions Ishtalinga in his Vachana. Somewhere he says, Prithvige Parvatave Linga. Mountain is a lingam for the earth. And this is one of his famous Vachanas. He goes further than these two people. He asks Shiva to get out when he is at work. ಉಳಿಯ ಮನೆಯಲ್ಲಿ ಪ್ರತ್ಯಕ್ಷನಾದ ಪರಮೇಶ್ವರನ ಕಂಡು ಇತ್ತಲೇಕೆ ಬಂದಿರಯ್ಯ ಹೊರಲ ತಿತ್ತಿಯ ಹೊತ್ತಾಡುವವನ ಮುಂದೆ ನಿನ್ನ ಬೆಳ್ಳಿಯ ಬೆಟ್ಟಕ್ಕೆ ಹೋಗೋ ನಿನ್ನ ಭಕ್ತಿಪ್ಪ ಠಾವಿಂಗೆ ಹೋಗೋ ಎನಗೆ ನಮ್ಮ ಕಾಮ ಧೂಮ ಧೂಳೇಶ್ವರನೇ ಸಾಕು. On seeing the Godhead appear on the edge of the chisel piercing the hide, I said, why are you here, sir? In front of the one that moves about carrying this bag of flesh? Go away to the dwelling places of your devotees. Free them. Go on to the top of your silver mountain. Enough of your masquerades. Go free your devotees. By the grace of Master of lust, dust and smoke, go and prosper. I don't need your blessings. My master is Kamadoma Dhuleshwara. I am blessing you, go. So here is not the celebration of bhakti, it's a kind of dissolution of bhakti through the act of labor. I'll have a few minutes. And now this burglar, Kannada Maritande. So his job is burgling. I don't know whether it was a legal profession in those days, because in Vachakatikam, this Charudatta, his house has been burgled, and the burglar has dug the hole so beautifully, Charudatta admires his artistic skill. But Maritande was a burglar, and he says, he uses the metaphors of his trade. For the master of my picklock, I slaughtered a goat, sacrificed a monkey, dedicated my parents, And even in spite of this, the stolen object does not come to me lovingly. I declare, Lord of Mara, Mareshwara, Mara is another name for Kama, Manmatha, God of love. Lord of Mara, the love god, the foe of Mara does not exist. So he transcends the deity, Ishtadevata, to the act of labor. Another Vachana by him, it's a little more humorous. If I am a thief at night, that would be a shame to the master who gave me the picklock. If I enter houses when people are forgetful and asleep, that would be a shame to my art of theft. I wake up the forgetful, show them the riches, and then bring out my own too, O Father, Lord of Mara, love God, the foe of love God. It's a different way of using this metaphor. So stealing here is only metaphorical, but uses images from his trade. Here's another Vachana poet called Turga Hiramanna, Ramana the cowherd. ಉದಯದಲ್ಲಿ ರುದ್ರನ ಕಾವ್ಯ, ಮಧ್ಯಾಹ್ನದಲ್ಲಿ ವಿಷ್ಣುವ ಕಾವ್ಯ. ಉದಯದಲ್ಲಿ ಬ್ರಹ್ಮನ ಕಾವ್ಯ, ಮಧ್ಯಾಹ್ನದಲ್ಲಿ ವಿಷ್ಣುವ ಕಾವ್ಯ, ಅಸ್ತಮಾನದಲ್ಲಿ ರುದ್ರನ ಕಾವ್ಯ. He says, I keep vigil of, at dawn I keep vigil of Brahma, at noon I keep vigil of Vishnu, at sunset I keep vigil of Rudra, at night after I drive the herd back to their folds, I ask, oh, when shall I be rid of this cowherd staff? No, the cowherd staff shall not drop from my hands until Vishveshwara Linga, the Lord of cowherds. For him, Shiva is a big cowherd. Gopatinatha Vishveshwara Linga ceases to be. So here again, they talk about the death of God quite often. Kamadevi also talks about Channa Mallikarjuna, Kulva Bhashe. This language is a language of killing Channa Mallikarjuna. Allama Prabhu also talks about it. Vachana says, Ganga Devi Munde Yadaru. Ganga, Shiva's spouse. Shiva has this Pati Patni or Wo business. Ganga is Wo. Patni is Gauri. Ganga Devi Munde Yadaru. She became widowed. Gauri Devi Ole Ekadidaru. Gauri removed her, took off her earrings. Vasudeva Vimana Hottu, Vasudeva, he carried the buyer. Vayudeva Kulyanikida, wind god set it on fire. Attindatta Gogeshwara Sattanemba Suddhi. From then on, the rumor that Gogeshwara is dead. So, this is another dimension of bhakti. When bhakti transcends bhakti itself. Allama does it in the way of mystics do, but these artisans do it in their own way. I just can give one more example, and I'm going to conclude soon. Now there is this, just two more examples. One is Ramanna Kauhar is over, and then this Chaudeya, who's the ferryman Chaudeya, Ambigara Chaudeya. So his job is to ferry people across this river or lake, whatever it is. He says, entering from behind a nondescript, this is somebody else, this is, this another Vachana poet was street performer. There were a group of Vachana poets who were street performers. Kalaketaya is a kind of Bahurup. Bahurupi Chaudaya. Bahurupi is the semi-untouchable performing tribes you find all over India. They were one of the tribes, denotified tribes of India. They are still sacred beggars of India. And then Nagaya Maritande, the comedian Maritande is another one. This is Chaudeya, many Bahurupi Chaudeya. See, these Vachanas show that Vachana poets did not communicate themselves in the literary fashion by reading the Vachanas to an audience. They were composed orally, they were sung out, they were performed also. And unfortunately, we're looking at Bhakti text as if it's literature, written literature. It was not. It was a kind of, I hate the word performance, so it is poetry in action. Poetry which is staged in a particular way. So he says Chaudeya Ferryman. Okay, I finished that. Let me read this Chaudeya first. Here I come, a bodiless ferryman, to the great river. If you pay the price, your mind is the price that you should pay, that grasps and lets go. So Vachana poets talk about this. Mind can only do things, grasping things and relaxing it. In Tantras, this is called Unmesha and Nimesha. So grasp the mind that grasps and lets go. I'll take you across the great stream, says Chaudeya the ferryman. All the other Vachana poets use the name of the Ishtadevata as the signature line, like North Indian poets like Kabir and Tuka and Naneshwara, Maharashtra, etc. Chaudeya uses his own name as Ankita. And now the last example I'm giving is from Bahurupi Chaudeya. He's also Chaudeya, but he's not the boatman Chaudeya. He's a Sikh of Bahurupi. Entering from behind a nondescript curtain, putting on many guises of the living, I was playing the form of the Lord of all beasts. I shattered the amplifier, tore up the curtain, proclaiming things living are nowhere in space. I was hearing Naginatha, dear to Rekanna, Purahare, Purahare. This is one of the war cries which is used in Vachanas sometimes. Another Vachana says, donning 84 million disguises in splendid forms, I came to amuse my kinsmen. They do not know the beauty of many guises. All the splendor of many disguises dissolves into formlessness. This reminds me of Prospero's prayer at the end of Shakespeare's Tempest. When they vanish, dream figures vanish into thin air, he says, into formlessness in Naginatha, dear to Rekanna. So this is a unique soteriology characteristic of Vachana poets of the 12th century. And there is no guarantee that all these poets were Basavanna's contemporaries. Very few of them mention Kalyana, and according to my friend Professor Nagabhushan Swami, who has built up this Vachana website, he says most of the Vachanas with Basavanna's name occur by these artisan saints are interpolated, because the language is not that of the Vachanas of the 12th century, because Vachanas continued to be written till the 20th century. Even Bendre wrote some Vachanas, he called them. Kuvempu also wrote some Vachana poems, but they are modern Vachanas. They're in different. One more thing I want to point out, that this act of labor is in itself a means of spiritual illumination for laboring Vachana poets. Whereas when Vachana poets from other social backgrounds, like Basavanna and Kamadevi, talk about, for example, hunting, their attitude is totally different. For Ganada Kannappa, hunter by profession, hunting is not just an act of labor, it's a spiritual act. But Akamadevi, in one of her Vachanas, says, a fisherman, after entering the water and searching, rejoices at killing many creatures. Why does he not grieve for them as he would if his baby died in his own house? This is how Akamadevi looks at the job of fisherman. And Basavanna in other Vachanas, he says, Yallara gandaru betege hodaru niyeke hogi elegandane. In that, he talks about the horror of this hunting. For him, hunting is nightmare. But for the hunter, it's something else. So this sociological difference is reflected not only in the language, but also in their approaches to spirituality. So, though numerically they were dominant, those who represented the path of the hand were marginalized over centuries when the sect of Sharanas became institutionalized during the age of compilation. It's called Vachana Sangopana Yuga. During the rule of Prabhupada Devaraya, the Salva dynasty in Kalyana. Thus, when all the Shunya Sampadne, the two different kinds of anthologies of Vachanas began. One is Shunya Sampadne, the first compiler is Shivagana Prasadi Mahadevaya, and then the other kind of anthology which classified Vachana according to the philosophy of Shastala, six-phased philosophy, which is a kind of the response of the new Virashaiva sect to Shastala Sadhana Bhakti Yoga, but not much of the Shastala is found in the Vachanas of the 12th century. So these texts were called Shiva Yoga Pradipika. There were different Shiva Yoga Pradipika. Vachanas were used as depicting different stages of what was considered to be Shiva Yoga. But the word Shiva Yoga has other connotations in other schools of Shaivism. It has a different connotation in Tamil Shaivism, the Shaiva Siddhanta and Tamil Siddha tradition, and a totally different meaning in Kashmir Shaivism. So these were the texts which now we are looking at Vachanas through the filters of these texts. But if we read Vachanas themselves by ignoring these narratives, we see other kinds of meanings and the many undiscovered dimensions. And it's important to read them because they not only throw light on Vachana tradition, Sharana tradition, which is one of the Bhakti Siddha traditions of India, but they also help understand other traditions. For example, this caste business, people have talked about, last time I talked to some people say the Vachana's tradition represents a revolution against caste system, and some other foreign scholars like Blake Michael, who's worked on Shunya Sampadne, they say that Vachanas revived and strengthened the Brahminical hold on society, and which means Vachanas were revivalist. I think both readings are inaccurate because the Natha Siddha tradition belongs to that part of Indian spirituality, deliberately avoiding the word Hinduism, which is called, Natha tradition is called Guru Parampara, or Nada Santana. Here the lineage is not biological. Kabir's guru was a Ramananda Panthi, a Brahmin. Kabir was a Muslim. Sheshnal Sharif was a Muslim. His guru Govind Bhatta was a Brahmin. And Karkori Madiwadappa was a Lingayat. His disciple Chandur Jalal Sahib was a Muslim. And Brahmaya in Andhra was a goldsmith by caste. His disciple Rajappa was a Muslim. So in Guru Parampara, it is not biological, a caste lineage. It is Guru Chela lineage. And Sharana, then why does Basavanna say that my ancestors are cobblers, tanners, not Brahmins. Because he disengages himself from this Bindu Parampara, which is biological lineage, to qualify into this Nada Parampara, Guru Parampara. And these days people are debating whether Kanakadasa was a Kuruba or a Nayaka. There are two kinds of Nayakas, N-E-I-K Nayaka, N-E-Y-A-K Nayaka, according to Havner Commission. But Kanakadasa, what does he say about his caste? He says, when the moment he took this initiation into Hari Bhakti, Bukutaraadaru enna nurondu kuladavaru Bhakuti margake yogya nanadeno. He says, I've completely, not only me, all my clans people have been rid of the stigma of Kula. Whether Kula is caste or not, Professor Balagandha Gangadhara has confused all of us by trying to mix up these two words. I'm not going into that. So, is freeing oneself from caste, not revolution. We say it's a peaceful revolution. They could not change the casteist oppression society, but they were able to create those spaces where people from all castes and communities could come together on a common platform without discrimination. That's what Bhakti tradition, most of them. There were also some exceptions in Bhakti traditions. Because if you look at the genealogy of Bhakti tradition in India, there's a heyday of Bhakti culture when great poetry is written, new forms of art come into being, and later it's institutionalized by theologians, and then it loses its energy, and then compilations, anthologies, interpretations, arguments, doctrines begin. Just as poetics, in some sense, is the death of poetry, theology is the death of Bhakti and Siddha traditions. This happened to Vachana tradition, this happened to Tamil traditions also. We had to recover Bhakti from Bhakti theology. And what I'm trying to do in these lectures, in some of my recent presentations and writings of Vachanas, is to recover this quintessence of Vachanas, which have gathered the rust of institutionalization and theology.
Thank you for staying on for the full conversation. If you like what we do, please share it with your friends and family. You can also leave us a review or rating on iTunes and Apple Podcasts. The crew that makes these podcasts possible is Gaurav Krishna on sound supervision and production, with support from S. Sarvanaraj and Raghavendra Tenkaila. Artwork and design is by Chandni Venkataraman of Crisscross Design Studio. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel on your favorite podcast platform. It can also be accessed on our website, bangaloreinternationalcentre.org. Do follow us on Instagram for updates on all our programming. This is Lekha Naidu signing off on behalf of everyone at BIC.